What I'd like to do quickly in this video is try to grapple with maybe using the Australian War Memorial as a source that you could actually discuss in a history extension essay in question 1. So just trying to offer you some ways you might begin to think about analysing the Australian War Memorial as a source. And I think it's not a bad source to think of, one, because it's very contemporary, in the sense that there's a lot of debate around this at the moment, and two, because it's something a little bit different to just, say, a regular historian. But it does raise some of the same questions. What I'm focusing on really is the exhibits of the War Memorial. As we'll see in a second, the War Memorial is a very complex institution, and it's probably impossible to talk about everything, but thinking about the exhibits in particular might be a way of kind of focusing our attention a little bit for the purposes of this in history extension. So just thought I'd begin with a little bit of factual information to be clear about what the War Memorial actually is, does, and where it kind of in a sense came from. It was first conceived by Charles Bean, who was the Australian official historian for World War I. And so the story goes that he conceived of the idea, I think around 1916, while he was off reporting on soldiers' conditions in the trenches on the Western Front. And Bean had a very strong connection to the soldiers that he mixed with, the average kind of rank and file soldiers of the army, and wanted to preserve what he saw as their contribution to the war. Saw their suffering, saw the circumstances in which they lived, and wanted to preserve that, particularly the people who had died as a result of that conflict. It took some time, obviously, for that to become a real thing. So I think there was a competition in the late 1920s, about 1927-28, when they took designs from architects, and that was decided upon, and the design was decided upon, and in 1941, during the Second World War, it was officially opened. Formally, the institution actually includes three kind of elements. There is the shrine. There is also what they call on their website a world-class museum. The exhibits that many of us have seen, and also an extensive archive, which is available to professionals and the public through the Research Centre. So it is, as I said, a complex institution. The institution is run by a director, so there have been 10 since 1941, but it's generally actually overseen by the Federal Minister for Veterans Affairs, so it's a federal institution. The current director is Dr. Brendan Nelson. The War Memorial is actually a formal corporation which was established in 1980 with the Australian War Memorial Act, but is overseen by the government. For example, these are some figures that I was able to find recently, that in the 2011-2012 budget, the federal budget earmarked $48.154 million for the Australian War Memorial. It's important to note that that's not its only source of funding, though. So it received an additional $32 million to upgrade the galleries during the centenary, so 2014, 2015, 2016. And it also makes money from things like its publications and selling parts of its archive, not necessarily completely, but say, for example, allowing people to use photographs that they're required to pay for the copyright for. So its archive has become a source of income as well. They also get donations and other things to help run the costs of the institution. And also, just to point out kind of its general where it sits, the average number of visitors to the War Memorial hovers around about 800,000 per year in recent, say, the last 15, 20 years. These are the most recent figures I could find, but in the first year of the centenary of World War I, it received 1.14 million visitors. So it is fairly popular, and as we'll see later, it's actually very popular in terms of a tourist attraction. The gentlemen in Honest History have argued that this is an interesting point, that you would actually expect, so this is a graph of the visitors, and obviously there's a spike here around the centenary, so that's an important thing that they point out. They also point out that you would be thinking that the War Memorial had a little bit more of a trend upward over time. And their point is that it seems to be relatively static. They also point out that in 1994 there is a centenary here as well. Okay, so not a centenary, sorry, an anniversary. So there's a spike here is their point. That was their suggestion. Interesting to note though, there's quite a dip here at 2004. So the point here, I suppose, is that figures have been relatively stable around that 800,000 mark, but there has been a spike in recent years, and there's a lot of kind of questioning and debate about all of this. What does that actually mean, and so on. So if we connect this to the themes of history extension, the aims and purposes of history, if we look at the War Memorial, well, according to the website, the War Memorial's purpose is to commemorate the sacrifice of those Australians who have died in war. So that's its stated purpose. Its mission is to assist Australians to remember, interpret and understand the Australian experience of war and its enduring impact on Australian society. So there's its stated purpose. In 2016, Brendan Nelson was actually asked to comment on the centenary and other things, and he, along the way, actually suggested that the Australian War Memorial is a paradox. There is much more here than war. So in his view, it's a place of love and friendship, love of family and of country, honouring those who have devoted their lives not to themselves but to us and their last moments to one another. So that not necessarily an official statement of purpose, but is interesting to note how that overlays with perhaps the official statement from the institution. There is, however, I'll point over here, these are official statements about aims and purposes. There's much debate about whether there are actually hidden purposes here. So there are lots of people who weigh in on this and suggest that, say, it's actually part of a continuation of conservative masculine Australian ideals. The people at Honest History also use the idea that it perpetuates Anzac-ary, which we'll have a look at in a little bit. So Honest History, Peter Stanley, Paul Daly, a number of people who are commenting on this kind of thing, that that it actually has a political purpose as well as just this kind of commemorative purpose. In terms of the construction of history, what does it show us about that, or how does it actually go about it? Well, you've got a number of things for the institution. We'll get to the exhibits in a second. The Research Centre facilitates formal research, so PhD candidates are often in there using the archives, and other university students, master's students, and so on. There's also informal research that's done there a lot. So people can go in and ask, this is my grandfather's name, he fought in the Second World War, can you help me find some documents about him and stuff like that? That's a common activity there as well. The War Memorial also constructs more academic formal history. So they have an official magazine that's often written, articles are written by professional historians and archivists and so on. And also they're involved in the production of some official histories as well. So there's one underway at the moment, an official history about, say, the Australian involvement in post-war conflicts in peacekeeping and so on. The team of professionals, there is a team of professionals, I should say, that are actually permanently paid and staff the institution. So people like Dr. Lachlan Grant and Carl James, both of who have written many academic works, actually. So professional historians who have, in a sense, made their name outside the institution are employed on a permanent basis. And that team size can fluctuate, but they are there to assist in all of the activities of the memorial. They also run conferences and seminars, so they have national and international conferences, generally relating on themes relating to war and obviously its impact on Australian society. And then, of course, there are the exhibits. Many of them are permanent, and then they also develop specially designed exhibits from time to time. So let's have a quick think about them in terms of the construction of history as the focal point. What do the exhibits actually do historically? And what do they promote and how do they operate? Well, the main connection really, or the main connection between the public and the history of the War Memorial is actually those exhibits. That's why they're worth thinking about more specifically. Most people don't go out and read the magazine Wartime or the official histories and so on. Most people who visit the War Memorial visit the exhibits, look at the all of the different aspects of them. So in constructing their history, the exhibits in a sense are generally narrative style. So they feature a range of artifacts usually, so including digital items. Okay, so lots of shells from the First World War. They have things like weapons. They have things like uniforms. They have things like maps. All sorts of things that contribute to the general historical landscape in the War Memorial. They also have, if you think about it, and these are important, plaques or labels of commentary that go around the exhibits and help put things in their context or connect up different artifacts and so on. So the memorial is quite diverse in that sense. Also, it's important to note here, and I think this is a critical point, that is that they suggest that an average of about 5% of the entire collection at the memorial is on display at any one time. What that suggests is, in terms of the memorial constructing their history, there has to have been some element of selection, sequencing, and in addition to that, explanation interpretation going on. If it's the case that 95% of the material sits in the archives, then that's suggesting that someone has prioritized the information in the War Memorial, in its exhibits, as being more important than the stuff left in the basement. So this is exactly the same in some sense as a historian sitting down to write a book and choosing a quote from a diary they have as representative of perhaps of the thing that they're talking about. The War Memorial has done the same. It's just an object, or sometimes it is a diary, an extract from a diary, and so on. So this is an active construction that's going on. That's the important point. They haven't just put out all of their objects and let them speak for themselves, so to speak. They've arranged them, commented on them, put them in certain lighting and in connection with each other. So it is constructed. What does this suggest about the changing construction of history? So another major theme of history extension. Well, I think the general place of the War Memorial raises some interesting questions. One, I think it's reflective of a growing role of public institutions like museums in developing and shaping public memory and public history. So what's my evidence here for saying that? Well, it's interesting that it was voted the most important landmark in Australia and also in the South Pacific in 2016. So in a sense, it's gaining notoriety as a very important institution from the public's perception. And if their perception is that it's important, then it probably weighs heavily on their interpretation of Australia's past. So not just historians weighing in on our history, but these public institutions that are very frequently visited. It would be interesting to know how many of those 800,000 average visitors a year would pick up academic works of history and read about the things that they'd seen in the memorial. I would assume that it's not necessarily a large proportion of those people. It's also, I think, in connection to this, maybe part of the process that is challenging professional historians for their dominant place in historical discourse, okay, and also in shaping public memory. And this is not something necessarily new or exactly out of left field. This has been something that people have been grappling with for a while. Take the historians Ashton and Hamilton in their book History at a Crossroads 2010 are grappling with this, and they're suggesting that academics, historians in Australia are still widely respected. They don't deny that, but they also say they are only one of many sources of knowledge about the past in the public perceptions. And their practice is often seen as very foreign to everyday lives. Whereas something like the War Memorial, I would argue, museums are actually seen as very accessible rather than foreign. You can go into a museum and you can see things and you can hear noises. You can, in some cases they might display an interview with a veteran or something like that. You can connect very quickly to it. So museums are popular for that reason. And this is part of the changing landscape, if you want, of the historian in the 21st century and also the 20th century, but from our perspective, 21st century. The idea that historians are competing with institutions, this is a good example of that, but also things like the internet and television and so on, right? So more public and popular forms of history. So that's an important point to make, that it is a part of the evidence of the changing construction of history and the way history is produced and consumed in modern societies like Australia. If we begin to analyse and evaluate the War Memorial, what things can we begin to say? Well, let's look at how other people have kind of commented on this. This is a website worth exploring, Honest History. They have a newsletter, okay? The idea that they're suggesting that they're trying to promote a balanced consideration of Australian history, okay? So that's their general stated aim. Honest History, a couple of important people to point out here. One of the main patrons is Peter Stanley, former principal historian at War Memorial, but David Stevens is another academic historian who does most of the everyday writing, I believe, for the website and the newsletter. And they've made the point that the Australian War Memorial promotes what they call an Anzac-centred view of Australia's past, present and future. And they're arguing, therefore, it's actually distorting the way we see Australian history. Hence their argument or their suggestion that they're trying to promote a more balanced consideration of our history. Now, whether that's true or not is up for grabs. Paul Daly, another important person to think about here, who has written publicly about this. Now, Paul Daly is a journalist, and he writes a blog called the Post-Colonial Blog for the leftist journal The Guardian newspaper, now mainly done on the web. And he's written a series of articles on a range of things, and one of them is the War Memorial. It would be worth going and just even Googling some of those articles and having a look at it. This one's a great one. I think this was written actually in 2016, Australian War Memorial, the remarkable rise and rise of the nation's secular shrine, loaded with kind of suggestive terms here. What does he say about the War Memorial? He actually suggests one of the problems is that it doesn't adequately address Australia's military history. So he's not saying it's distorting our general view of Australia, only that. He's suggesting that it's actually distorting our view of Australia's military history because it doesn't address anything about the colonial or frontier wars in Australia. His point here is that basically what the institution has done is politicized our history. It's kind of ignoring the Aboriginal warriors from Australia, and therefore distorting our view of Australian war and so on. He also suggests that the memorial has and is playing an important role in what he calls the militarization of Australian history. And that is that he's suggesting that our history is becoming increasingly seen as a history of military events. What were the important events in Australian history? World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, and so on. Rather than other things that were important to shaping our past. And I suppose the point is, if something like the War Memorial becomes too popular, and most people derive some large sense of their history from it, then they think of our past in terms of this military sense. And so his suggestion is that it's distorting our view of our national story. A couple of other comments that I'd make here to maybe get you thinking about the War Memorial. It's certainly become an important part, I think, of Australia's what we might call the new history war surrounding Anzac at the centenary. And these issues of commemoration, the militarization of history, and so on. And the War Memorial's become the target of a lot of that discussion and defense. So some people say that this is not actually a relevant criticism, but it does actually raise some important questions about that. How do we draw where do we draw our information about Australia's past? And how do we develop a sense of what was important in Australia's history? An institution could be quite a powerful, or play quite a powerful role in that development. I think it also demonstrates a general point, and that is that public institutions are susceptible to the same or similar social political forces that historians are. Okay, and just like any historical source, they require critical examination for that same purpose. And this is a point that Ashton and Hamilton actually make as well, and that is that often people actually treat museums as fact because they have physical objects. And it appears to the average person, say, that this is true because it's there, I can see it, I can almost touch it. Whereas a book written by an academic, they would argue maybe has a kind of a certain connotation. And I guess what is important here to remember is the institution of something like the War Memorial is just one other factor involved in the development of historical discourse. And so we should treat it with the same criticism. But there's also unique problems, I think, that are interesting exploring here. The War Memorial has to construct its history primarily for a public audience. It is a public space that you can go to. It's designed to attract visitors. In fact, a big part of their job is to try and keep numbers up. So this raises a whole bunch of problems about perhaps, is it distorting history for a particular purpose, or is it doing something for a particular purpose that undermines, say, historical accuracy or historical balance, or something else that you might consider to be an important part of the historical process. You might not worry about that. You know, the fact that it's got professional historians operating in it might, to you, suggest that it actually is not just a crazy institution running a political ideology that's very obvious. Also, I think it raises a fundamental thing about history, and that is that history is never just about sources and facts. History, whether it be in a book, a speech, a documentary, a film, or an institution like the War Memorial, is always positioned. That would be, in the case of an individual historian, their personal position, but also in terms of an institution, perhaps the individuals who run it is important, the social context in which it sits, the political context in which it sits, and the underlying ideologies maybe operating around it. Couple of questions just to finish up that I think you might want to think about as you consider the War Memorial as a source, and you begin to analyze it yourself and perhaps read some articles on it as well to try and develop your sense of what it is and does to the historical discourse in Australia. Does the commemorative purpose of the War Memorial mean that it will inevitably distort accurate representation of history? Or can it actually be as, say, balanced as a balanced historian? Is that possible? Or because it's commemorating the lives of soldiers, does it actually have to represent their life and their wars that they were involved with in some kind of at least neutral light? That's an interesting question. Second question, to what extent has the history presented in the War Memorial been politicized? That's a similar question. Is it highly selective for a particular purpose? Do you think that's a reasonable criticism? And is it a criticism of most institutions? It's difficult to say. Also, finally, what might the Australian War Memorial reveal about the nature of history in modern societies? And we've just talked about that idea that it plays a public role, and it raises the issue of what role public institutions have and should have in the national conversation about our history. This is not something unique to Australia. America and many other nations have the same debate, but it does raise questions about the role of public institutions in this particular in our particular space. So I think what I'd encourage you to do here is think about developing a sense of the War Memorial and those specific things, and maybe focusing in on its exhibits. Maybe have a look around, read some of those articles, perhaps by Honest History or Paul Daly or someone else, look at someone who defends it, and try and develop your own sense of what this has to say about history in general.